Do you exist as an individual person, as an individual entity called the self or the soul? Or, upon investigation, is there no such individual being to be found? Is the belief in such a thing simply a kind of illusory appearance that you've been fooled by? We're going to look at the teachings of Plato, the teachings of Buddha, and the teachings of Shankar today to see how some of these foremost spiritual authorities approached this issue, how they solved this issue, how their various doctrines in some ways disagree with each other, but we're also going to try to see places where these doctrines of self or not self can actually come together, bridge, find a common ground, and some kind of agreement between each other. So I hope that you enjoy the video. Do we exist as individual entities or do we not? This is the root of some of the most important philosophical investigations in both Western spiritual traditions and in Eastern spiritual traditions. And to kind of begin to get into this issue, we can say that this problem arises from one fundamental question. Who is the doer? Who is responsible, or what is responsible for the rising of your thoughts, of your emotions, things like this? Now, this question goes beyond our basic neurological answers. It goes beyond the basic answer of, well, the brain is, what thinks about these different things or what has these ideas. The, existence of this wasn't necessarily, the existence of a brain making decisions wasn't necessarily beyond the intellectual grasp of some of the foremost spiritual thinkers and philosophic thinkers in human history. Instead, they went a little deeper into the issue in terms of why is it we think what we think when we think it, even in the absence of external stimuli that may have given rise to that. Not only that, why is it that many different kinds of beings across different cultures, many different humans across different cultures, different beliefs, different values, have ultimately very similar approaches to the world? And not just human beings, but in fact, many animals we can look at seem to display qualities that make them at least very easy to anthropomorphize. If whether we're projecting that onto them or whether they actually have some of those traits themselves. We can see birds that mate for life. We can see animals grieving deeply the loss of a loved one, the loss of a brother or sister or spouse or child. We can see mental health issues with different animals in captivity or even in the wild. And so, and none of these seem totally strange. Now, one could argue that we're simply relating to these non-human things in a human way. Yet, to some of these great thinkers, such as Buddha, such as Plato, it seemed like there was a little bit more to it than just that. And so these issues give rise to this question: who is the doer? Is there an individual being at the core of our experience that is in charge of everything? Or is that simply completely seated in the brain, and beyond the biological self, there is no such individual entity? This is more or less the dividing line here between some of the Eastern traditions and some of the Western traditions. Now understand, there are somewhat non-dualistic Western traditions, and there are very theistic and dualistic Eastern traditions. But here, in this video, what we're going to be looking at in particular are the teachings of Plato as kind of being the exemplar of teachings about selfhood, teachings that revolve around the soul, because Plato's notions about the soul either directly or indirectly influenced all of the great Christian and Jewish and Muslim philosophers, mystics, spiritual leaders, and religious leaders, doctors of the church, so on and so forth. And so if we kind of return to the root in Plato, we can get a very straightforward and often very interesting philosophic arguments for the existence of an individual entity, right? Of some kind of independent existing being at the root of all of our experience, who in its own way is in charge of our experience and who learns and benefits from our individual experience. Some of the Eastern exemplars we're going to be using going to be Buddha and Shankar, who both in a sense represent different takes on non-duality. Buddha has a very non-theistic take on non-duality, and Shankar has something bridging a somewhat theistic approach to non-duality. And we're going to kind of look at both of them as important teachers and thinkers in regards to this issue of Anatma, this doctrine of there not being an individual self, what some of their arguments are for it, and how they approach it. One of the interesting things about this subject, I find, is that regardless whether the tradition holds that there is an individual self or there isn't, they all begin with at least an assumption that there is some kind of independent self. There is some kind of individual entity. In other words, all these paths begin with what is intuitively and apparently real to me. They all begin with what is our intuitive grasp of reality. We feel just naturally in our interactions with life, and we can tell from the way that we interact with things, that we definitely consider ourselves to be independent beings. We consider ourselves to be individuals with histories, with futures, with narratives, with ideas, beliefs, psychological and emotional structures around those ideas and beliefs. And we use all of this to relate to the world around us. And we feel quite distinctly, or at least our body teaches us very distinctively, that there is a difference between ourselves and the world. There's a separation between ourselves and the world. And because of this, there needs to be a relationship between ourselves and the world. There needs to be a way that we approach the world in a way that benefits ourselves. So whether the tradition is dualistic or non-dual, in terms of whether it acknowledges the existence of an independent self or not, they all begin at least with this basic parameter that you at least believe yourself to be an individual, and so we have to begin from there. You have to do some kinds of practices, you have to follow some kind of moral code or tradition or doctrine, there's certain visualizations, different mantras, there's meditations you have to perform. There's some kind of acknowledgement that there is at least the appearance of an individual self, and because we are very fixated and wrapped up in that, that's where we have to begin. Now, if there is an individual self, we have to now start looking into it. We have to investigate it. So both traditions really, and by both I mean the dual and the non-dual, or those with selfhood and those which teach Anatma, no self, we have to begin at least with acknowledging what's apparent to us. It appears that there's a self. So now the next step is, what do we do about that fact? How do we investigate this appearance? And from here, this is where the different traditions begin to kind of deviate and split a little bit, is how they understand the results of their inquiry into this matter. We can kind of recreate this approach ourselves if we look at it beginning with the assumption that there's some kind of appearance here, there's some kind of self, there seems to be an individual self. I'm able to stand when I want to stand, sit when I want to sit, I can have a drink of water, I can plan out my day. And even though my day doesn't always unfold the way I thought it would, that doesn't mean that there's not an individual entity or self here. So I can begin with that, with what I believe appears to be some kind of personal entity. And I can begin to investigate it. And really, if we look at it from the Platonic and the Buddhist perspectives, one of the first questions that arises is, where is this entity? Where is it seated? Is it seated in the body? Is it seated in the brain? Is it seated in something that's supraphysical? Okay, so when we say, is it seated in the body, we really mean the five senses in the brain. Can we, in any way that does justice to our experience of life, can we come up with a definition or a placement, a trait or quality of the self that explains our experience of life? And this will be a whole other video actually to go deeply into, and I think I'll do a video on this soon, because it's a very interesting subject. When we look at it, we can see that the body really just has its five senses. And so as far as the body is concerned, our life is a cacophony of colors and sounds and tactile sensations like hard and soft and hot and cold, so on and so forth. Yet we don't see any of the deeply psychologically driving factors through our five senses. When we think about our life, we don't describe our day-to-day experiences through a series of colors and tactile sensations and smells and things of that sort, right? Instead, we describe our day-to-day life using incredibly psychological terms. We talk about meaning, we talk about success, we talk about shortcomings, things like depression and sadness and joy and excitement. We form dreams and ideas about the world, about ourselves, that don't exist anywhere physically. We can't really point to them and point them out and say that, well, this is the weight of my ambition, right? This is the particular dimension and size of my gratitude that I'm feeling right now. Yet our psychological experience of life, at least, seems in a way to transcend in many ways our five senses. From here, it may be quite easy then to say, well, then it's a psychological, it's still a neurological experience of life. Our brain is formulating different ideas, formulating different thought patterns to connect all these different sensory stimuli. Even in the absence of those stimuli, it can still contemplate these ideas. And as nice as that may be as an idea, most of the spiritual thinkers and philosophers throughout the world have recognized that there's a bit of an issue here, and in fact, it's not as cut and dry in modern neuroscience either. There's a bit of an issue here as to how can we watch ourselves think. This is strange. How can the subject and the object, which are supposed to be different, really subject and object have to be different. So how can the subject be watching the object of one's thoughts? In other words, how can you watch yourself? How can you be aware of yourself and watch your ideas, watch your emotions, watch your physical activities with a sense that in some way that isn't you? Because the watcher and the watched are separate. The subject and the object are separate by definition. So how can you experience yourself to be something other than your thoughts? Which is obvious that we experience ourselves to be that way, because oftentimes we have thoughts that disagree with themselves. We can be at odds with ourselves. We can want to do something and not want to do it at the same time, because there's different parts of our own nature clashing with the idea. Maybe we want to have the pizza because we feel like eating pizza at that moment, but maybe we don't want to have the pizza at the same time because we know that we want to lose some weight, we want to go on a diet, whatever the case may be. So our ability to watch seemingly every single one of our psychological functions, no matter how subtle or how concrete it may be, our ability to do this seems to imply some kind of distance between the functions of the brain and the being that is experiencing the functions of the brain. For the purposes of this video, we're going to kind of circumnavigate a lot of the arguments and issues around that. We may do a separate video on it later. But we're going to just kind of jump to the conclusion here that all of these figures, all these authorities, Shankar, Plato, Buddha, and many, many others throughout history, have ultimately come to the conclusion that our seat of experience, our sense of self at least, is not rooted in anything biological. It's not rooted in anything corporeal with form. Instead, we have to look to something more incorporeal. And this is really where these different traditions begin to veer away from each other, is how they understand the incorporealness of our experience, how they understand the incorporealness of the experiencer itself. What is Plato's response to this issue of who is the doer? Trying to figure out or pin down exactly what Plato thought about anything in particular can be quite difficult, because the nature of the dialogues, the way the dialogues are written, is intentionally kind of open-ended, so that you're meant to contemplate and reflect. The dialogues are written to encourage contemplation and reflection, not to just fill your head with answers. Plato's main purpose was to try to teach people how to think, not what to think. So when we talk about what Plato thought about something such as the soul, really we kind of have to refer to the consensus of many of the great Platonic philosophers who succeeded Plato, and how they understood or how they inherited down from teacher to teacher what Plato's thoughts were on these things and ideas on these things. So really, for the sake of this video, when I talk about what Plato thought about something, understand it as being kind of a quickly stated summary of 2,500 years of philosophy in the Platonic tradition and some of the greatest philosophic thinkers in history coming through that tradition. So Plato, his approach to this issue of where's the seat of our experience, from this he kind of derives all of our conceptions about the soul that have become very popular in Western philosophy and in Western religion. Plato's ideas about the soul directly or indirectly influenced Christianity, influenced Islam, influenced Judaism. In fact, some of the Platonic scholarks, the people who actually ran the academy after Plato, one if not two of them, were actually very important parts of the Jewish community, Jewish Sanhedrin, and wrote important commentaries, such as Philo, wrote important commentaries on the Bible. So Plato's ideas about the soul in many ways colored much of how the modernized, or at least the Western world, understands these things. To try to sum up what his stance was on this, it goes something like this. At the seat of all of your experience is a knower. The soul is essentially a knower. It knows things. It is always trying to know more. And because it is a knower, it is trying to always do what is best for a knower, which is to know the best things, to know things that are lasting, to know things that are true. And the most important truths are the ones that never change. So in Platonic philosophy and mysticism, we are engaged in this struggle, which goes through many, many lifetimes. In some of the dialogues, Plato gives cycles of tens of thousands of years, goes through many lifetimes of self-discovery, of trying to learn more about itself, learning more about the universe. Plato's whole concept of salvation and realization is largely derived or inspired from the Delphic maxim, to know thyself, one of the main Delphic decrees. And this maxim was at the center of much of Socrates' life and something he was always trying to encourage in people. And Plato, being one of Socrates' main disciples, was intensely influenced by this. So if you're going to know yourself, there must be a self to know, right? If we're going to be able to follow the Delphic dictum to know oneself, there must actually be an object there, some kind of independent entity at the seat of our experience that we can know, that we can call the self. And this, in much of Western spirituality and philosophy, ends up being called the soul. And there's some very interesting issues that arise from the existence of an individual's soul. It comes with issues such as, is there sin? Is there not sin? How does the soul fall into ignorance? What is the relationship of the soul to the rest of the world? Is there, where did the soul come from? Right? Do souls just emerge out of nothing, or do they come from some kind of eternal source? Where's the repository of this eternal knowledge that these knowers are always trying to move towards, right? How do they gain this knowledge? Is there a difference between eternal knowledge and temporary knowledge? How do we come into body? The list goes on and on. There's many different issues with it, which is part of why the philosophic traditions and religious traditions that believe in an individual soul can become very philosophically and spiritually bloated sometimes. Because when we start talking about a soul, so many complications come into the issue that it becomes hard to have a nice, simplistic, straightforward philosophic approach to the matter. Instead, it can often end up being very long-winded, very wordy, very complicated. And this, in some ways, I think, has turned a lot of people off of that approach in modern spiritual practice. To Plato, salvation comes when the soul finally shakes off its mortal coil, so to say, its bondage to material, or what's called generated nature, the world as we know it. When the soul is able to shake this off and rise into the realm of pure intelligence, okay, which is similar. Plato's use of the word nous, or of describing noetic reality, is actually quite similar to the Buddhist concept of awareness. By talking about intelligence, he doesn't mean intellection in the normal human way. When Plato talks about some kind of ultimate reality that is pure divine mind, pure intelligence, he's speaking about something much more similar to unending eternal awareness, or kind of self-arisen primordial awareness. And many of the later Platonists consider this to be primal being, primordial being. Right? The beingness itself, suchness itself, existence itself, from which all other independent individual forms of existence are able to be derived. And to Plato, the soul is placed somewhere in the middle of pure being and fabricated being that is always changing. Plato calls this world, instead of calling it Maya or illusion, Plato calls this the world of coming to be, because nothing ever stays the same here. Everything here acts like it's trying to become something else. So it's always changing and transforming in one way or another. And Plato sees the soul as being kind of smack dab in the middle between these two things, between eternity and non-eternity. So the soul, therefore, now becomes immortal. It's something that almost has a false eternity to it. It has a beginning in Platonism, but it doesn't necessarily have an end unless everything else comes to an end with it. So in this sense, when we have the existence of a soul, we have an odyssey that has to take place. We have a journey that has to take place. We have a destination, a goal. We have actions and things we can do. To Plato, the soul in many different ways benefits from its experiences through knowledge, through learning more about itself, more about the world in relation to itself. And so this is where many different spiritual techniques, practices, many different mystical approaches, religious approaches can end up arising from. And the whole doctrine of a soul especially gives rise to a kind of monotheistic, really just any theistic approach to the world, because it becomes about the relationship of the individual soul with some kind of ultimate reality or ultimate soul. And because there's an odyssey, there's a journey, it becomes this issue of how do you bridge that gap? How do you draw nearer to that? So there's a distinct sameness and difference. Everything is not the same. Okay, it is a dualistic school of thought in that regards, but it's one which is at the heart of many of some of the greatest spiritual traditions in Western history. Having had a very quick tour of Platonism, we're now going to move through an equally quick tour of Buddhism and ask, what is Buddha's response to this issue of who is the doer? Where is the seat of our experience? Where does the seat of our action arise from? So in Buddhism, we have a different approach to the self being incorporeal. Buddha and Plato both agree that our corporeal existence is not the seat of what we are. That's not our essential being, even though it may be the seat of most, if not even all, of our experiences as we normally understand experiences. The actual essence of our being, that which is witnessing our experience, that which is in some ways experiencing our experience, is not corporeal. So Buddha and Plato see eye to eye on this. And the issue is, to what extent do they qualify incorporeal? Buddha has a very strict definition of incorporeal, where there can't even be thought forms or Plato's ideas involved in the situation. He says that when we look in the different teachings of Buddhism, Buddha says that if we look into the nature of ourself, if we begin to inquire deeply into who we are, what we are, if we exist as a tangible, independent entity, tangible here not meaning corporeal, but just that something that we can directly experience. If we exist as an actual entity, then there should be some proof of our existence. We should be able to qualify our existence according to definable terms that we can qualify anything's existence with. Right? We can talk, for example, about even incorporeal things such as beauty, wisdom, goodness, virtue, as well as things like mathematics, which are incorporeal, geometry. We can talk about incorporeal things with discrete and definite, definable terms. Right? We can label traits and qualities to these things that show that they exist, that there are definite boundaries between these ideas and terms. So in Buddhism, the approach to examining the self is to see if you can do this with an idea of a self. See if there is any kind of central entity or identity about which you can actually say it is definable, that it has traits, it has boundaries, it has qualities that are distinct to it and that differentiate it from something else. And really, Buddha's revelation and what kind of is at the basis of his realization and of Buddhism itself, in his experience when he was sitting under the Bodhi tree, he realized that this can't be done. He realized that, at least from his perspective, any attempt to give definite existence to an independent entity at the root of all of one's experiences fails. Any attempt to do so is met with failure. That is, try as you might, you cannot define some kind of central being that has any definable traits and qualities that other existing beings have, whether those existence are incorporeal or whether those existence are corporeal. Regardless, you simply cannot define a central self. Now, a problem obviously arises. If there's no self, why do I experience that there's a self? How come I can get up and go do things and talk to people and things like this? So with the doctrine of Anatma comes another really important teaching, another really important doctrine, which is the doctrine of karma. If you're going to remove an individual doer, then you have to have some kind of mechanical process involved to explain how things appear like they're getting done. If there's not going to be some kind of individual doer, you have to have some kind of process, some kind of theory that can explain how it is anything at all seems to be happening, how it is that I can experience myself to be moving around. So enter here the idea of karma. This is where this becomes such an important teaching, not only in Buddhism, but also in Indian Advaitism as well. There needs to be a process that explains our movement and our activities, and karma means actions. And so we can say that the brain is caught up in this cycle of activity, of doer, and of the reward of doership. But just because the brain is caught up in that does not mean that we essentially are caught up in that. Likewise, it follows, if there is no independent doer at the essence of our own existence, there really is no reason there should be an independent doer at the center of the cosmos itself. So Buddhism lends itself to a much more non-theistic approach to reality, which is one of the reasons why I think it appeals so much to many practitioners today, because there's a lot of things in Buddhism that can really easily sync up with observable facts of the universe through science and quantum physics. Been some really interesting communication back and forth between those fields of discipline. Next, I feel we have to look at Shankar's view on this matter and see what Shankar's response to this issue of doership is. When I was first putting together the notes for this video, I was just going to do Plato and Buddha, kind of back and forth, comparing, contrasting between them. But really, it's hard to do justice to the concept without approaching Shankar, because Shankar is kind of a really interesting philosophic and spiritual middle point between these two. Shankar's tradition and his teachings in a lot of ways have the theism that Platonism lends itself to very easily. Plato's concepts and ideas of an ultimate reality lend themselves to a sense of some kind of ultimate deity or some kind of being that itself isn't empty, that is full of something, full of energy. Right? Platonism is actually a spiritual tradition and philosophy of illuminism, this sense of fullness that's always radiating and creating everything, is at the heart of a lot of Platonic worldviews. And Shankar actually has a view of ultimate reality that lends itself much more to Plato's ideas of the good and of the one than it does necessarily to Buddha's concepts of emptiness. Yet, Shankar's approach to this matter of who is the doer is the same as Buddha's. Okay, he agrees with Buddha on this, and that's probably because the Buddha himself may have drawn this idea or been inspired in some way by the Upanishads. It can often, I know it can be a hot subject amongst Hindus and Buddhists, but it can be difficult to figure out who came first, the Upanishads or the Buddha, and to what extent they influenced each other, because all of a sudden, out of nowhere, these teachings of there not being an individual self start popping up in roughly the same area of the world. So it's hard to believe they didn't influence each other. So Adi Shankar, he's born in a really interesting time. He's born at a time where Buddhism is taking over India and Hinduism is losing ground quickly. And Hinduism itself lends itself greatly to theism. Obviously, it's a very theistic religion, many different deities, and some really advanced, very beautiful philosophic teachings about deity, similar to the Western religious traditions. And Shankar was born at a time where there was this kind of back and forth. There were a lot of debates happening, actually, between prominent Buddhist leaders and prominent Hindu leaders. And Hinduism was having a really hard time being able to deal with some of the incredible philosophic points that the Buddhist masters were putting forth. And as a result, Buddhism was spreading. So in an attempt to kind of save his religion, Shankar began teaching. And he developed his own particular brand or take on non-dual teachings on Advaita, which was already, he didn't create this. I mean, it's there in the Upanishads, which far predate Shankar. But he really became one of the foremost proponents of Hindu Advaita teaching, so much so that he's seen kind of as the chief authority on it. And especially in the English language, he's the most accessible for us. But his take's very interesting. He's a middle ground between these two. He has a somewhat theistic view of God. When you read a lot of his writings, there's a relationship to Brahman, to ultimate reality, that doesn't make Brahman seem like a negation. Like Brahman is not a negative quality of existence or something that is completely empty and free of any kind of existence. Brahman is a very positive existential force, which itself, somewhat like the Platonic concept of the good or the one, has Brahmajyoti, has a light from it that is radiating from it, that emanates, that all the gods are made out of, all the different levels of reality are made out of. And so his idea of the ultimate reality is quite amenable to Plato's views, but yet that didn't lead him to accept the idea of an individual self. His views on there being some kind of independent entity separate from that total reality of Brahman agree more with Buddha, that there's no self, that upon investigation, you can't find there being any evidence of a self. And so I wanted to kind of just present Shankar for a moment here too, because his take on this is quite interesting as a middle ground between the two. And it was so important for him to be a middle ground between the two, because it really ended up saving a lot of aspects of Hinduism and even Indian Buddhism from each other, right? Because it became kind of a safe ground for theories from both traditions to thrive and to promulgate. Now that we've done a kind of quick tour of three very important but different approaches to the issue of the self and reality in the spiritual tradition, three figures who have really influenced pretty much all aspects of modern spirituality very strongly, I want us to look now at a problem that is central, that's pivotal to all spirituality, that's really at the root of all spiritual traditions, whether it's Platonism, whether it's Buddhism or Hinduism, it doesn't matter. This issue kind of remains the same, and it's the problem of salvation. Whether there is a self or not a self, how do you understand the kind of central human problem of suffering, of pain, of despair, anxiety, sadness, so on and so forth? How do you understand the central human issue of suffering? How do you relate to it, whether there's a self or not a self? How do you relate to this problem, and how do you try to transcend it? How do you try to overcome it? If there is a soul, such as the Western religious traditions put forth and as Plato espouses, if there is an individual soul, is it capable of freeing itself? Or is it in its current problem of suffering and pain? Is it in its current conundrum because it is alone, it's an individual entity, so therefore it's kind of isolated or separate from the totality of everything, and therefore needs to depend upon something that is whole, that is unified, that is greater than it? And from this issue, many of the different Western religious views end up arising, that there's some kind of ultimate reality that itself is intelligent, theistic, is not a doer in the way that you and I are doers, right? It's not a thinker in the way that we are thinkers. But it has the energy, the power of salvation, that the more we can draw near to it, whether we do so religiously through things like prayers and austerities and fasting, or we do it more mystically through inward contemplation, turning inwards and trying to find the root of our being, trying to return to our source. In either situation, the soul ends up depending upon something, and a kind of religiosity starts to arise, which is something that teachings about the self is very prone to, which is not a good or a bad thing. It's just simply what it is, that if there is an individual self, all of a sudden there opens up many interesting and rather complex ways of relating to the world, of relating to the universe. If there is an individual self, am I accountable for my actions lifetime to lifetime? Am I accountable for my actions in this lifetime? Is there such a thing as good and bad for me? If I exist as an individual, then is there something good and bad for me? Because everything else that I can see that seems to exist, there seems to be something good and bad for it. There seems to be things that destroy it and things that nourish it or support it, right? There seems to be creation and destruction. Am I prone to those things? If I am, who created me? Will I ever be destroyed, right? All these kinds of issues arise, which, as I said earlier, can be very complicated and somewhat convoluted, and I think that's why people in modern spirituality tend to vie away from them. But at the same time, there's incredible power. It's very interesting how many ways of relating, not only to the world around you, but to a concept of ultimate reality, how many ways of relating to ultimate reality there can be if it's accepted that there is a separation, that there's some kind of difference or distance or journey between you and that ultimate reality. Of course, teachings about the self, in some ways, very much appeal to our situation in today's world, because there's not monasticism in those Western traditions. Like, for example, Plato didn't teach any kind of monasticism or renunciation of the world, whereas the Eastern non-dual teachings, whether it's Buddhism or Shankar, strongly lean towards renunciation, right? Strongly encourage monasticism. And whereas monasticism did arise in Christianity, it never really took root in Islam, it never took root in Judaism, it never took root in the old Greek traditions. It was not a common part of, or a common way to relate to ultimate reality in these traditional teachings about the existence of an independent soul. Instead, if there's a soul and there's a body and there's a divine being, we can now relate to the world in a very interesting way. We have a way to relate to the world through morality, through virtue, through good conduct, through religion, through prayer, and things of this sort. So despite some of the complications that arise from the dichotomy of self and other that happen when we believe in the existence of a soul, or hold this as our main central view, it also opens up endless avenues of creativity, of energizing ourselves and practicing. And it doesn't necessarily deny the existence of a world. And so we're able to kind of be householders and have a job and get married, have children, things like this, without needing to constantly tell ourselves, none of this is real, I don't exist, they don't exist, my wife doesn't exist, my children don't exist, right? The concept that's really at the heart of Platonism is a very humane philosophy. It's something that's very easy to accept as human beings and very easy to integrate into the human experience. Buddhism and Advaitic tradition, on the other hand, are not as easy to integrate into our normal day-to-day household experience. Though modern Advaita, since people like Ramana, who himself was not a householder, but some of his devotees who became very popular after his death were householders, and people like Osho and others, popular spiritual teachers, Jaggi Vasudev and others in today's world, are trying more and more to make non-dual teachings relate to everyday practitioners, relate to every householders. And non-duality is incredibly appealing because at its essence, it can be so simple. Okay, that doesn't keep there from being endless schools of philosophic thought and approaches within Buddhism and within Advaita in terms of how to fully understand all the different issues and complications that arise from a non-dual view. Neither of these views are without complications. There are problems that arise when you think that there is no self. And there are problems that arise when you think that there is. And it's really kind of an issue of figuring out which one of these resonates more with you and becomes more practically useful. In the Buddhist and Advaitic traditions, because there's no self, it can be a little bit more difficult to relate to normal household life, which is full of duties and jobs and obligations that all seem to point back and reference you existing as an individual entity. It's full of dreams and ambitions and hopes. It's full of relationships with others that are directly influenced by you. And so it can be difficult to integrate that non-dual idea into household life. And this is one of the reasons why monasticism and renunciation figure so prominently in those traditions, because it's much easier to contemplate that you don't exist as an individual identity. When you're living in a monastery, you have no control over what you wear, you have no control over what you eat, you have no control over what you're going to do that day. Everything is at the mercy of the abbot or whoever is directing the monastery at that time. And you're going to sit and practice, or you're not going to eat. And you're not even going to have any control over what you eat or when it's bedtime or anything like that. So when you're living in a life where you have very few responsibilities, if any at all, and what responsibilities you do have were forced upon you, they weren't things you necessarily asked for, and you're not in charge in any way of your day. You're not in charge of whether your life is going to be a success or a failure. You're just going to go through the motions. And because of that, in that situation, of course, it's easy to contemplate that you don't exist as an independent identity, you don't exist as an individual being. On the other hand, if you're in the midst of a household, working a 9-to-5 job with a family and children and people who depend on you and lots of obligations, it can be difficult to conjure up the motivation to push yourself and to try to succeed for the sake of others when somewhere deep in your mind you feel that neither you nor them exist. And so these are kind of issues that arise from both perspectives, whether we hold there to be an individual self or we feel that there isn't such an independent entity. When it comes to understanding both viewpoints as they approach concepts like liberation and enlightenment, we have this kind of central issue: how does ignorance arise? Right? If there's an individual self, is it weaker than the world, that the world can push ignorance upon it? Is the source of ignorance the world, or is the source of ignorance in the soul? And if the source of ignorance is in the soul, was it made with that ignorance? Was it given that ignorance by something else? Or was it born without ignorance and then somehow developed it? Both sides of the problem become somewhat problematic, obviously. If God is making everybody ignorant, that's not a nice sounding idea. And if you were born free, how did you become ignorant? Right? Did you just make yourself ignorant? And how exactly did that happen? So there's some complications there. And then if there isn't an individual self, again, the same issue arises. Who's the ignorant one? Is it just the brain? And if it is just the brain, does the brain somehow totally transform or change upon realization and enlightenment? Is enlightenment itself just a neurological state? If it's not a neurological state, which seems to be the view of Buddhist and of Advaita, if it's not a neurological state, whose state is it if there's no individual self? If it belongs to some kind of supreme reality, how did the supreme reality ever fall into ignorance? How did it ever fall into delusion? So both sides of this issue have their own problems, just like they kind of come with their own blessings. So how much does this issue really matter? It appears to be a huge contradiction, and certainly our brain, the thinking part of us, really wants one of these to be true, or at least more true than the other. But I would rather put forth a different notion, different idea, which is that both of these are simply different ways of relating to the experience of life, different ways to relating to the fact of our own existence, which is something that both sides have to end up agreeing on. Whether that existence is individualized or not, it doesn't really matter. There's an experience of existence that's happening. And how we relate to that experience is either going to be individualized, or it's going to be really as a non-individual. And there can be really interesting benefits and blessings that arise as a result of either one. Both of these traditions are full of amazing saints and sages and philosophers and original thinkers. And they're also both full of people missing the mark and falling short and so on and so forth. When we look at it, despite what appears to be a really important contradiction, instead we should ask, how much are these doctrines really at odds with each other? All of these traditions believe in some kind of central, unchanging, eternal reality that is at the basis of all things. They all teach that the physical world is more of an appearance or illusory or constantly changing. Right? Shankar calls it Maya. The Buddha also call it Maya, or constantly changing. Plato calls it the world of coming to be, because nothing ever stays the same. And all of them have a relationship to the world of the five senses that says that the five senses really are not to be trusted. They don't give us an accurate perception of reality, which is something that we actually know to be true now due to quantum physics. We know that our five senses don't show us reality the way that it actually is. We don't see each other or experience ourselves to be a bunch of subatomic particles and subatomic particle fields. All of these traditions, at least at the beginning, accept the importance of a moralistic worldview, of training in virtue, of do's and don'ts, and good and bad, both moral good and bad, psychological good and bad, physical good and bad. So even those traditions which deny the existence of an independent entity, or even go as far as to denying physical reality in its entirety, which different parts of Advaita can do oftentimes. Despite all of that, they don't tell you to go out and just be, unvirtuous and unknowable. Instead, they still encourage that one follows the religious rites of their tradition. They still encourage that you have some kind of rule or duty or way of life that you live by, some kind of personal dharma that you follow, if not a greater dharma in the forms of one of the different religions. And they encourage that you be a good person and that you do virtuous deeds. So they all agree about that. They all agree that our essential nature is incorporeal, that our basic nature is not something that can be confined or described to the physical body and to our physical experience of life. All these traditions hold true that it is our ignorance of our basic nature that gives birth to our suffering, and that suffering is actually something we can do something about, that we can cure this ignorance and therefore overcome the particular kind of suffering that this ignorance about our true nature constantly leads us towards. They all teach that self-knowledge, that learning about our basic nature, whatever it may be, whether there's a self there or not, they all teach that that knowledge is pivotal to our personal spiritual freedom and salvation. They all teach that the personality itself is illusory, that it's just going to go down into the ground and be buried with your brain and your body when you die, that it doesn't necessarily transcend and continue into further incarnations. They all teach that compared to ultimate reality, all other appearances, by comparison, don't really have authentic existence. There's really only one true authentic existence at the heart of all things. And with both of these viewpoints, both those which teach that there is a self, the traditions that teach that, and the traditions that teach that there is no independent self, they each have so many amazing saints and sages and siddhas and miracle workers and enlightened masters that ultimately it makes one have to wonder, how important really is this issue of whether there's a self or whether there's not? Is it something that we should get too hung up on? Or should we rather see it as a way of relating to the world, of relating to our experiences in life, and we simply choose whichever mode we happen to get the most out of in that relation? So I thought this would be just kind of an interesting examination and look into some of these different principles and some of the different teachings on this issue of the self and on the teachings of the self. I'm certainly not in any place to solve the dispute. I can't sit here and say affirmatively which one is or which one isn't correct. And maybe nobody is really. But I thought it'd be interesting to really take a decent look at the situation from a bit of a bird's eye view through all the different traditions. Obviously, a short video like this can't do justice to any of these traditions. It would take 100 videos just to get a thorough grasp of Platonism, 100 videos to get a thorough grasp of Buddhism, of Advaita. So there's no way, we can actually fully deal with the situation in its entirety just through a simple YouTube video. But hopefully it's been educational and enjoyable for everybody. And if you like the video, please make sure to hit like and to subscribe to the channel to keep up with all of our new content. Thank you.